Wonderful to see all of these faces, and hopefully our overflow room will start to fill up as well. But welcome everyone to the first lecture in our fall 2019 lecture series titled Make Space, which has been organized by the Women in Architecture Student Organization, more commonly known as WISO. Yay, yeah! And I am really, really excited, and honestly, I have to get very matriarchal for a second, very proud of this group of dynamic students. I had the pleasure of working with them over the course of the summer as their faculty advisor, very light advising. These women are powerhouses and very organized. But in terms of just helping them kind of structure the lecture series, but I really wanted to acknowledge the depth of their efforts and the seriousness of their efforts and their real desire to kind of influence the dialogue that we're having here in the school. And so I wanted to read from the poster. I'm sure everyone has seen these beautifully designed posters, but the thing that I think is really significant about them is that they're almost a sort of manifesto, and so they provide a kind of framing argument for the entirety of the lecture series. So I just wanted to kind of speak to some of those aims really quickly. So they're asking us to make space for an expanded canon, equity in the profession, and designing a more just environment. Make space for a diversity of ideas, for radical positions in architectural thought, and for considering the full range of possibilities in design. Make space for architecture to more clearly reflect the society that we live in. And I think they've selected an incredible roster of architects and practitioners here to come and speak at the University of Minnesota throughout the fall series, in addition to two panel discussions that'll be in October. And so I think all of you should join me again in acknowledging their incredible planning effort and their desire to bring these expanded dialogues to the school. So thank you. Okay, and now Meg is going to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. We just really want to thank Jennifer and the School of Architecture for giving us this platform. My name is Meg. I'm an MArch student and an organizer in WISO, and we are so glad to be with you here today and to introduce our first lecturer, Ana Maria Leon. She is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan and holds an architecture degree from UCSG in Guayaquil, an MArch from Georgia Tech, an MDes with distinction from the Harvard GSD, and a PhD in the history, theory, and criticism of architecture from MIT. She's an active member of several collaborations to broaden the reach of architecture and history, the Feminist Art and Architecture Collaborative, the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, the Settler Colonial City Project, and Nuestro Norte es el Sur, Our North is the South. She's an architect and a historian of objects, buildings, and landscapes, and a key lecturer in this series. And her perspective on how we relate to each other through spatial practices and in discourses of power and resistance will make space for us to question and collaborate in a new way. So please welcome me and please join me in welcoming Ana Maria Leon.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you so much, WISO. Yes, I am so impressed and so honored to be part of this series, and I have been so welcome and so nicely hosted by you. I feel honored to be part of the lecture series and part of this effort. So thank you so much. I want to acknowledge that we meet today in the occupied land of the Wapekute, the Anishinaabe Waki, and the Oseti Sakowin or the Sioux. I have called this lecture My North is the South in allusion to this manifesto by Uruguayan artist Joaquín Torres Garcia, who in 1935 reversed the map of South America and argued for the point of view of artists working from the South. And he said, I have called this the School of the South because in reality, our north is the South. There must not be north for us, except in opposition to our south. Therefore, we now turn the map upside down, and then we have a true idea of our position, and not as the rest of the world wishes. The tip of America, the Americas broadly understood, from now on, insistently points to the south, which is our north. And this requires some translation because in Spanish, we speak metaphorically of the North Star, the Northern Star, as this guiding post. Just gonna remind myself not to speak too long. So the North Star, the north would be a guiding direction. So we say we're oriented to the north. And what Thomas Garcia did is sort of he turns this metaphor literally upside down and pushes us to think of geography as a critical position. So echoing this call, I seek to practice, research, and teach from the critical and conceptual position of the South through the production of discursive spaces and narratives addressed to or from the point of view of excluded or underrepresented voices. So in today's talk, I'd like to take you through 3 interrelated examples of how I think I do this or try to do this, of teaching, research, and a kind of practice in which these 3 areas sort of overlap and all grounded by the same politics. And I will conclude with some thoughts on those politics and on the ways in which they seek to make space, per your series title, for voices, projects, and regions traditionally excluded, in the belief that in doing so, they lift all of us. I understand this critical practice as simultaneously a form of producing architecture, of practicing history, and of teaching histories of space making. So I'll start with a class that I teach. And this is a course I teach at the University of Michigan. It seeks to bring together case studies from North and South American cities, so cities from all over the Americas. The course compares the effects of formal, discursive, and technopolitical approaches to the cities of North, Central, and South America, understood as one diverse and interrelated region. So rather than discussing modernity as a phenomenon brought from one supposedly more modern region to another, we read various theoreticians from Berman to Quijano, Dussel, and Garcia Canclini, and think about modernity as co-produced through global networks of exchange whose effects are experienced differently in different regions. And I'll explain what I mean by this. But we start by examining grids, which are a very formal tool of architecture, as a system to colonize and settle the land. So we compare the grids of the Law of Indies, which organized urban centers in Latin America, to the US National Ordinance of 1785, gridding the incremental territorial acquisitions of the United States west of the Mississippi and all the way to the Pacific. So these grids are not only formal ordering devices, but instruments of settler colonialist expansion. And to understand them, we need to understand these sort of incremental expansion occupying indigenous land. Starting with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which opened up land north of the Ohio River and into the Great Lakes for settler colonialist expansion, a moment that has been described by historians as the foundational location for genocide in US Indian policy. At this point, the series of US military operations were mobilized by the state with the express instructions to, quote unquote, extirpate native populations from the area, further pushing the remaining populations westward. Thomas Jefferson's acquisition of the land west of the Mississippi from the French, known as the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, further increased the siege on the indigenous population. And we have a quote from Thomas Jefferson from 1807, reacting to indigenous resistance in what is now Michigan, where I teach. Jefferson instructed Governor William Hutt to inform Potawatomis and Ojibwas near Detroit that, quote, if ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi, unquote. So the course then turns from grids to infrastructure and complicates this relationship between cities and regions by tracing the expansion of the railroad across the United States plains and the Argentinian pampas. This expansion necessitated the extermination of native populations in North and South America, that is the Great Sioux Wars and the forced relocation of populations into reservations in the US, and the conquest of the desert in Argentina, leading to the virtual elimination of the Tehuelche. And I'm going to return to these wars. These events linked the Industrial Revolution, a story that usually centers on European capitals, to resource extraction from the plains and the genocide of populations that inhabited them. Thinking about these processes more globally allows us to understand that the displaced indigenous Tehuelche in the Argentinian Pampa and the isolated London factory worker are both experiencing different ends of the same modernity. So thinking from the South means understanding these processes not only at a so-called center, but in their full global complexity. Other components of the course include the construction of national identity, comparing Washington, D.C., and the expansion of avenues in Buenos Aires. And we also discuss bigness as a nationalist trope by comparing Wright's Broadacre City, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, to Ford's failed community in the middle of the Amazon called Fordlandia, which was took cues from Broadacre City, to Lucio Costa's Brasilia. So all these visions of expansive modernity are tied together by the car. Ford's failed rubber plantation in the middle of the Amazon forest was meant to feed the production of automobiles from the New World for high-speed highways. So the consequences of these thinking become clear when we compare the urban causes and consequences of oil dependency, that is, the growth of US suburbia, and the transformation of Venezuela into an oil nation. This country's turn away from agriculture resulted in massive migrations to the cities and the growth of slums. So Levittown and Caracas, I argue with this course, need to be taught together. Otherwise, we're ignoring the global consequences of US planning. So if we only look at the expansion of US suburbia, we're not fully acknowledging the effects it's prompting in changing in cities worldwide. Thinking, again, from the South allows us to see these traditionally ignored links. The course then looks at public space as spaces of protest and turns to the results of economic collapse through a collection of concrete elephants, brutalist buildings, unfinished buildings, and buildings in ruins. We also problematize technology exchanges and housing solutions. We discuss utopian houses communities, and we finish at the border discussing borders between states, but also racial borders and borders prompted by real estate. Segregation and poverty in the United States. And here I teach at Michigan. Flint and Detroit are less than an hour from Ann Arbor. Take on different urban shapes that in South America. And students look at favelas in Rio or other slums in South America and think of urban poverty as something distant to them when it's just 40 minutes away. It's revealed to be, in some ways, more discriminatory and ruthless than the worst Latin American slum, what we see in Michigan. Thus, we finished the class in Detroit, learning from local Latinx activists and other people of color who are designing new tactics to claim their right to the city. So this is, I just sort of summed up a class that I teach, but it includes several case studies that I have researched, and in turn, it has prompted some new research of my own. And for that, I'm going to go back to this comparison between the US plains and the Argentinian pampas, to a comparison between Chicago and Buenos Aires as cities that are sort of a midway point between large railroad networks that are tied to a settler colonialist expansion. Teaching these cities, and here's just a timeline that I have found useful in the way it lines up the development of the railroad infrastructure to the wars against the indigenous population. Teaching these cities and their similarities has prompted some ongoing research which thinks through the relationships between their status as midway cities, between the plains that surround them as sites of extraction, and trade centers to the east, linking their growth to the development of the railroad, and ultimately to the elimination of indigenous populations in the Great Plains and in the Pampas. Settler colonialism, a distinct type of colonialism that replaces indigenous populations with a settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty, is a useful concept in this comparison. As critical discussions on decolonization increase in the United States, it's interesting to me to compare them to discussions on decoloniality, which have been theorized differently in South America and particularly in Argentina, often focusing on Latin Americans' relationship to the economic empires that have traditionally dominated their economies, Europe and the US, rather than the indigenous societies that still struggle for recognition within the region. So putting these discourses together has helped me illuminate aspects that had been sort of dropped off or been left behind in each case. We find US settler colonial concepts such as manifest destiny and the romance and nostalgia for supposedly disappeared indigenous peoples repeated in Argentina, a country that also waged war against its indigenous populations in the late 19th century in order to gain access to their lucrative land. Comparing these processes and the role that modernization, urban planning, and architecture have had within them is at the core of some of my current research projects. Anthropologist and ethnographer Patrick Wolf has famously theorized that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, by which he means it's not an isolated event that happened long ago and has nothing to do with our current contemporary present. It's rather an actual series of ongoing processes that continue to structure our contemporary lives. Teaching this history means understanding the colonial and settler colonial impulses behind the Jefferson Grid and the law of the Indies. In this context, Argentinian tropes, such as a fascination with the expanse of their plains, not in Spanish, but in Argentinian, the Pampas, the myth of the gaucho, which is an equivalent of the cowboy, and this willful elimination of the indigenous population from national identity resonate with similar tropes that are still active in the United States. So when we think about Buenos Aires, we often hear it described as the Paris of South America, this beautiful European city. And we don't think of the indigenous groups that lived in the region, such as the Mapuche and the Tehuelche, a legendary peoples that date back as far as 13,000 before Common Era, one of the first inhabitants of the region. We don't think of them because they have been eradicated from the histories that are told about Buenos Aires, but they are fundamental to the existence, presence, and form of the city. They were mythologized as savages and barbarians, and we can read those connotations, for instance, in this painting in which it's called the Raid of the Malón, Malón being this indigenous chief, sort of stealing away a beautiful white woman, and mounting horses that carry with them the insignia of the military in Argentina. So if Jefferson spoke about eliminating or exterminating the tribes and driving them beyond the Mississippi, similarly, Argentinian Army General and later President Julio Argentino Roca explicitly advocated for the obligation, the virile obligation, to eradicate indigenous peoples in order to appropriate their lands. So we find these parallel events in the history of both North and South. The Sioux Wars and the conquest of the desert are both wars against the indigenous people to appropriate land. And we find their consequences in the cities of Chicago and Buenos Aires as sites of exchange between the extraction of resources from the surrounding plains and gathered through the railroad and their shipment to regions beyond the Great Lakes and the Atlantic. So they're similarly transformed into centers, port cities that are sort of between the railroad and the shipment to other sites. So researching this history means theorizing the similarly necropolitical impulses behind the 19th century wars to eradicate the indigenous population and transforming the land which they inhabited, along with non-human agents such as the Buffalo Nation and others, into an extractive binary landscape meant to produce settler capital. The remains of these populations were imprisoned and often displayed, and architecture here also comes to play a role. We find it very explicitly in holding spaces built to imprison indigenous populations in the years after the conquest of the desert, and these are some of those spaces. But we also find it sort of less explicitly so in spaces like this one, which is the Museum of La Plata. It's a natural history museum, and following Tony Bennett's theorization of the exhibitionary complex, we understand museum spaces as spaces that organize these sort of various nationalist tropes in the production of a national identity and the formation of compliant citizens, informing them how and what to look at and how they should be thinking about it. By virtue of this instruction that the museum does, Bennett argues, the public sees itself in the place of power, and through this experience comes to constitute itself as a self-regulating citizenry. So Bennett's exhibitionary complex allows us to understand museums as spaces that represent forms of power and assemble willing and complicit audiences. I'm very interested in museums because I'm very interested in exhibition spaces and the ways in which they instruct us how to act. And I'm interested in exhibition spaces, particularly in the context of the overflow of architecture exhibition spaces, architecture curatorial impulses, and architecture biennials. And I'm going to show you something in a biennial soon. But I have done some work on the space of this museum, and you can see how the paintings in the background show you great sort of large creatures from a distant past, and they contribute to building this mythology of bigness. So some of my research looks at the architecture of this museum. It's sort of the ways in which it looked to create a narrative for Argentina as this large nation which went back to this remote past of these sort of creatures that were very big. So there's this narrative of bigness that I think resonates also with the United States. It has some funny images such as this one, and then some more stark images that attest to the violence that's implicit in the action of the museum. This museum exhibited live indigenous Tehuelche, including this gentleman in Acayal, who was a Tehuelche chief, and his family. They were exhibited, imprisoned in the museum and exhibited, and their remains were later exhibited also as the anthropological exhibition of the museum. The remains were not completely returned to the Tehuelche peoples until 2014. And this is also what I mean when I speak of these processes having a very contemporary present. And I research this, and when I teach it in my class, I also call attention to the University of Michigan's own possession of Native American remains and their very recent process of restitution that's still ongoing, which just makes students aware of their own position within these processes. I'm interested in the Museum of La Plata also in the context of another exhibition of indigenous architectural simulacra and indigenous peoples in Chicago at the World's Columbian Exposition. And you will note that the times are similar. The Museum of La Plata is also from the late 19th century. So it's happening at the same time as the World's Columbian Exposition at Jackson Park in Chicago. This exposition included a series of so-called Maya ruins, sort of indigenous, supposedly Latin American, and North American in the case of the Yucatan Peninsula, sort of architectural, fictional ruins, and also the exhibition of indigenous people, like this group of Inuit. But these were not compliant subjects. For instance, the group of Inuit that was sort of forcefully exhibited at the World's Columbian Exposition went on strike against the stringent conditions that they were subjected to. Other protests against these racist displays and attitudes were led by folk like Frederick Douglass, who presented, invited by the Haitian Pavilion, presented a text called "The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition," and by Simon Pokagon, a Potawatomi chief, who wrote, and I quote, "On behalf of my people, the American Indians, I hereby declare to you, the pale-faced race that has usurped our lands and homes, that we have no spirit to celebrate with you the great Columbian Fair now being held in this Chicago city, the wonder of the world. No, sooner would we hold the high joy over the graves of our departed than to celebrate our own funeral, the discovery of America. And while your hearts in admiration rejoice over the beauty and grandeur of this young republic, and you say, quote, 'Behold the wonders wrought by our children in this foreign land,' unquote, do not forget that this success has been at the sacrifice of our homes and a once happy race." Simon Pokagon wrote this text as part of a publication titled "The Red Man's Rebuke," which he later retitled "The Red Man's Greeting." But he kept the rest of the text intact and presented at the World's Columbian Exposition. So it's bringing me to the last case study that I'm going to show you today, which is in Chicago. So I actually just opened this project last week at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. I said I was interested in exhibition spaces. This is a first for me and the collective that I work on, in that we were actually invited to present in an exhibition space. And it was at the Biennial, which is held at the Chicago Cultural Center, this building. It's a building that has been justly celebrated as the People's Palace. And it's said of it, it's made for everyone and it welcomes everyone. And this claim testifies to its enduring status as a public monument that's accessible to all. And it makes very logical to have the Biennial there. But this building that's for the people of Chicago was only made possible by the extraction of land, labor, and resources from other people near and far in colonialist contexts. So if the Chicago Cultural Center is a palace for Chicago's people, then it is also an archive of the exploitation of colonized people whose land, labor, and resources yielded this palace's constituent parts. So attention to the building as an archive of colonialism suggests that it is also an inadvertent yet vivid memorial to colonial extraction, dispossession, and violence. So here I'm acting as part of this collaborative. This is the Settler Colonial City Project, and we are a research collective focused on the collaborative production of knowledge about cities on Turtle Island or North America as basis of ongoing settler colonialism, indigenous survivance, and struggles for decolonization. So we are a group of many people. And at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, we acted in partnership with the American Indian Center of Chicago and organized a series of actions, events, and publications. The actions were a series of what we called building annotations. That is to say, we annotated the materials the building is made of, the global processes of extraction that these materials participated in, the labor processes that assembled them, and the iconography that is present throughout the building and that contributes to the narrative of settler colonialism. So I'll quickly take you through these actions and then wrap up because, okay, yeah, I'm good. I don't want to run too long. So this is at the entry of the Randolph Street lobby. The building has two lobbies. And the first annotation reads, "This marble was quarried and assembled by exploited labor." And we explain in the text, and you can just pick up one of our publications, you can download them, it's all online, how the use of the luxurious marbles that you find throughout the building contributes to its monumentality, to its grandeur, but the marble was extracted from quarries in the United States, in Vermont, and in Tennessee, and also in Europe, in Italy, and in Ireland. And here, this is Vermont. The horizontally veined is white Vermont marble. But this marble was assembled by exploited workers, construction workers, whose submission to labor conditions was informed by the United States' most powerful and violent institution, the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry, the same institution responsible for the severe violence inflicted on Native American people. In Chicago, the U.S. Army 7th Cavalry was enlisted to manage striking laborers and their allies. It had previously been engaged in violence against Native Americans in the West. In 1890, the 7th Cavalry killed around 300 Lakota men, women, and children in the Wounded Knee Massacre. And 4 years later, in the course of the 7th Cavalry's deployment against striking Pullman workers, around 30 workers were killed at Pullman's factory. So the marble in the Chicago Cultural Center thereby draws together indigeneity and political radicalism as twin threads to the sovereignty of the modern nation state and that state's beneficiaries. On the other side of the Cultural Center is the Washington Street lobby, and here we are greeted by the seal of the city of Chicago. So we look at what the images contained in this seal. And we argue that the seal poses settler colonialism as peacefully replacing an indigenous world. The process, however, by which indigenous land became a space of capital extraction was a violent one. The city seal, you will see, includes a depiction of an infant floating over a shell, itself floating over the 19th century seal of the United States. And the infant brings associations of youth, innocence, purity to these representations of the colonial nation and the colonial city. But these cultural associations do political work. They attempt to replace the violence of settler colonial history, a violence that is nevertheless embedded in the seal's other elements. The name of the city, Chicago, references a French rendering of the indigenous Miami, Illinois word for a type of wild onion, the Chicago, known in English as ramps. And the word was later turned into Chicago or Chicago, also referencing a type of garlic that grew in the forests of the region. And yet this indigenous plant is not depicted in the seal. What we see instead is a sheaf of wheat, a crop indigenous to the Fertile Crescent and brought to North America by British colonialism. A more lucrative crop that took over the plains surrounding Chicago, and as the land was seized from Native Americans and transformed into a site of extraction. We also see a two-masted schooner in full sail depicted as arriving to the city and its supposed garden. So Herbs in Orto, the motto is city in a garden. But where is the ship arriving from? What does it carry and for what purpose? The schooner, a cargo ship, comes to Chicago and takes extracted resources, literally the sheath of wheat that it's headed towards, marking the city's primary purpose, securing the extraction of resources from this agricultural garden and taking them to markets elsewhere for sale. And while there are multiple erasures of indigenous presence within the Chicago Cultural Center, there is only one representation of indigeneity, and it's here on the city seal. According to Chicago's municipal code, the seal includes a depiction of, quote, an Indian chief with a bow and arrow proper, unquote. So with these weapons, so the code says that the indigenous man has weapons. The seal transfers the violence of settler colonialism to the only indigenous figure present in the whole building. Ironically, this presence, and we know this because we were trying to figure out how to do this annotation, and we wanted first to put some sort of acrylic over the seal and annotate the different parts, and they're like, no, you can't do that, because this was a difficult process because it's a historical building and we wanted to attach ourselves to the building. That this was very hard to negotiate. So we know that, ironically, this indigenous presence and the very seal itself are slowly being erased by the solicitous maintenance of the building. We could not put that acrylic because it would not let the cleaner do its job. The seal is cleaned several times a day when the lobby floor is cleaned, a caress that is gradually wearing the brass seal away. The only objects then allowed to touch the sole representation of an indigenous person in this building are an eroding floor cleaner and the soles of the many shoes that step on it throughout the day. And these small aggressions we find remind us of the larger pattern of settler colonialism, which masks the violence of erasure under the guise of so-called civilization. This room is called the Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Hall, and it joined the program of the Chicago Public Library as part of the original program of what is now the Cultural Center. In this memorial hall, soldiers who fought for the Union in the Civil War are remembered and honored. To memorialize, however, the Civil War is also to memorialize the Indian Wars that were initiated by and connected to the Civil War, each part of the westward advance of the United States Empire and the colonization of the West. So you see how there's an official narrative of the building to your left, and we have installed a sign to the right, sort of riffing off the official narrative and offering a counter-narrative. The victorious Union did not only take dominion of the South, the domain of the former Confederacy, it also took dominion of the West, the domain of Native Americans, both ancestrally and more recently. So-called Indian removal displaced many Native Americans from spaces west of the Mississippi. During the era of post-Civil War Reconstruction, many former Union soldiers, along with many former soldiers of the Confederacy, became shock troops redeployed to the frontier as the West was settled. And so the Chicago Public Library and the GAR Memorial Hall were not only two separate programs, they were also components of one and the same program, the program of the westward expansion of the United States Empire, accomplished by settler colonialism. Finally, this is the lobby to the Preston Bradley Hall. This room is decorated by, as well as several parts of the public library were decorated by Tiffany & Company, a world-renowned American jewelry company whose work at the building became one of its more renowned architectural achievements. Tiffany designed and crafted the mosaics and marble inlays throughout the building, as well as the dome in the interior of this room, which is the largest Tiffany-built dome in the world. Part of the eminence that Tiffany & Company was endowed with in the second half of the 19th century came from its investments in the mythical imaginary of this so-called noble savage and the Wild West frontier. Tiffany & Company produced ceremonial swords awarded to officers for service in the Civil, Mexican-American, and Indian Wars, firearms displaying such exotic scenes as an American buffalo hunting expedition, and decorated Smith & Wesson handguns and Winchester rifles, the latter marketed as so-called the gun that won the West. After the Civil War, when the concept of the noble savage emerged to legitimize displacement and annihilation of Native Americans, Tiffany & Company began to create objects that married supposedly indigenous iconography with white bourgeois taste, a project that historians have affirmed as, quote, a subtle integration of Native American themes, unquote, into the company's work. In the 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris, for example, Tiffany & Company created a series of pieces that were inspired, or so-called inspired, by Zuni and Navajo pottery, Sitka and Hupa basketwork, and Sioux war shields. The designers of Tiffany & Company partly relied on depictions of indigenous artifacts, by white artists like George Catlin. Beginning in 1837, however, the company also sent expeditions to the West to purchase artifacts from Native American peoples. And just so as indigenous peoples were being displaced by the gold and silver mining that yielded the raw material for Tiffany & Company's luxurious productions, native knowledge, culture, and lifeways were being appropriated and exploited by that same company's designers. So we argue that, rewarded by settler colonialism, Tiffany & Company thus rendered settler colonialism beautiful. We also look at the sumptuous mahogany that makes the doors of the Cultural Center. And we argue it was made available by the colonial dispossession of indigenous people and extraction of resources from indigenous lands. Most of the stately doors in the building were constructed in part or whole from mahogany wood. British companies began to extract mahogany from colonized lands in the West Indies, Mexico, and Central America in the 1820s. And by the late 19th century, when the Chicago Public Library and GAR Memorial Hall were being constructed, logging had depleted mahogany stocks and deforested landscapes in the Americas, leading to the intensification of mahogany extraction in other sites of British colonialism, in particular West Africa and East India. And the mahogany used in these doors was taken from East India. Logging all of these colonial sites devastated the plant, animal, and human systems that harvested wood had enmeshed within. Along with the clearing of forests by logging, forest ecosystems were damaged and destroyed by road building, the harvesting of animals for food for loggers, the dispersal of indigenous communities that had sustained forests, and many other interventions. This is the Yates Room, which was the former reading room of the library component. So as indigenous people were so-called disappeared into the West, the United States literature that the library was partly built to house became increasingly preoccupied with explaining this disappearance. These explanations typically revolved around the savagery of primitiveness of indigenous people and their corresponding incapacity to fit into the emerging modernity of cities like Chicago and nations like the US. The renowned United States authors whose names are written in mosaic tile on the arc of what was the Chicago Public Library's majestic lobby and quoted in its former reading room, now Yates Hall, were each invested in romanticizing and thereby legitimizing the supposed disappearance of indigenous people throughout Indian removal. At the top of this door, we read a quote from Emerson: "The world is founded on thoughts and ideas, not on cotton or iron." But Emerson's quote points us to a world of lofty ideas over trade, but it's precisely by transforming indigenous people into the objects of nostalgia and fantasy in their writing that these authors materially contributed to the effort to remove indigenous people from contemporary political, social, and geographical space in the United States and transform their land into a territory which profited from the very cotton and iron that this quote seems to dismiss. So we have a series of installations. This is the map of sort of the various signs that you'll find if you go to Chicago in an effort to what we describe as decolonizing the building. But to inaugurate this effort to decolonize the Chicago Cultural Center is not only to attend to the building's past and its relationship to colonialism, both in the United States and across the globe. This effort also can open up consideration of futures in which colonial pasts are remembered, addressed, and redressed. Decolonization is not a metaphor. This is a profound claim made by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, and I encourage you to read this very difficult but important article, and you can just find it by typing "Decolonization is not a metaphor." It's PDF is just floating online. But this claim, I'm wary of the term decolonization because it has become too much of a fashionable word, and it's important to remember what it means. It means the repatriation of land. This claim also leads us towards an imagination of the Chicago Cultural Center as hosting new publics and new spaces in a new future, each defined by an awareness of Chicago's colonial antecedents. So I'll tell you the last installation is in the Yates Room in the 4th floor. So as you sort of finish looking at the biennial, if you go to Chicago, you may end up, and this is at the top floor. And to understand that installation, you should understand, and this is one of several maps that Emily Kutil and Tyler Schaffma did as part of one of the publications of the group. So it sort of situates you in the context of the region and the city. In the middle of a series of treaties between the United States government and Native Americans and the coercion, deception, and violence that accompanied those treaties, the 1833 Treaty of Chicago with Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi people was taken by the United States government as a surrender of Native American claims to Chicago and its surroundings. And the city of Chicago was incorporated 4 years later. But at the end of the 19th century, when the building now known as the Chicago Cultural Center was designed, constructed, and opened, the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi laid claim to a part of Chicago that did not exist when the 1833 Treaty of Chicago was signed. This was the land east of Michigan Avenue, created by landfill in the 1890s in the wake of the Chicago fire. Chicago's post-fire landfills were the result of the need to dispose of vast quantities of rubble left by the fire's destruction. In the 1890s, this process yielded the creation of Lincoln, Grant, and Jackson parks. The Pokagon Potawatomi claimed that this land, because it did not exist in 1833, and so could not have been ceded by the treaties they signed. For the Potawatomi, both land and water were part of Potawatomi territory, and the 1833 treaty only ceded what was land in 1833. So this map is important to us. This is a hydroshed map of the Great Lakes, and it shows, we think of it as a map that shows, attempts to show an indigenous conception of the land, yet fails, but is instructive in its failure, because we know that maps are colonial tools. We are using these tools in an effort to decolonize, but we are also aware of the limits and our limits as settlers of different ethnicities, to understand indigenous ontology. When the map goes into what is water, the lines go straight, because the hydroshed technology cannot trace under the surface of the water. So you see the break in that technology. So we see the land as a continuum. So this conception of the landscape that is indigenous conception of a continuous landscape, not divided into land and water. And we see how Western technology fails at representing that understanding. So in 1914, the Pokagon Potawatomi filed this lawsuit in the Federal District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. The case made its way to the United States Supreme Court in 1917, and this is recounted in a beautiful book by Pokagon historian John Lowe. And in its decision, the Supreme Court held that the Potawatomi claim to land was premised on its occupancy on that land, an occupancy that ended when they abandoned the land in the wake of the arrival of settlers. The court therefore decided that the Potawatomi claim was without merit. Of course, they could not accede to the claim because it's the best land in Chicago, right? It's Grant Park. So they had to create this absurd argument that the Pokagon had abandoned land that was underwater. Because the Western conception of the land is, of course, it's either land or water, land that you can turn into real estate or water that's collective property. For the Pokagon Potawatomi, it's a continuum. So this absurd claim, this absurd argument that non-existent land could be abandoned reveals the way in which the United States law was structured by settler colonialism and the distance of both law and colonialism from an ethical relationship to the land. So sitting on Michigan Avenue, the Chicago Cultural Center, that little white wall that says CCC, is therefore located on the frontier, right at the border between ceded and unceded indigenous land. A frontier that was and continues to be denied and invisibilized by the beneficiaries of settler colonialism, but is asserted and visualized by the indigenous people who colonialism displaced and dispossessed. So that's the facade. This is Michigan Avenue. And all these windows here are the Yates room, the reading room of the library. So we took over these 4 windows, which are the windows that look onto Michigan Avenue. So if you're familiar with Chicago, we are looking at Gary, Frank Gehry, and Frank Gehry is sitting on unceded land. And so we just pointed that out. So this is my historian's Photoshop, but I think it worked out pretty well because that's the way it looks if you go to Chicago now. And these are some folks looking at unceded land and reading about those histories. And there's one last installation. We are actually just in the process of installing it, which is in the American Indian Center, who has been our collaborator in this work. And this is a beautiful gym of the American Indian Center, sort of north of the Chicago downtown, which is full of all the flags of the different nations. And what we did is we took one of the sort of the prototype of the National Registry plaque, which is on the facade of the Chicago Cultural Center, and created sort of a similar plaque that tells the history of Settler colonialism in the region. So those are our actions, and you can find all this information on our website, which is settlercolonialcityproject.org. I just wanted to wrap up sort of looking back at Torres Garcia and pointing out that this is also a very settler colonial image. Torres Garcia was of Spanish descent, and his upside down world, he has a problematic relationship with Europe, so he also shows a ship arriving to South America. He was fascinated by indigenous aesthetics, but also sometimes problematically fetishized them. So he's a problematic figure to think through, but he compels me to turn this into a different type of conversation in which we think of the Americas and we think of this region as a whole. And I think as architects, as historians, and as teachers, we can participate in a conversation that thinks through these spaces and these peoples, which I understand as a politics of collaboration. I believe architects can participate in a politics of collaboration because we can resist oppressive spaces with spaces meant to lift up those who have been oppressed, and these are spaces meant for resistance. I believe as historians can participate in a politics of collaboration because we need to understand the histories of exclusion and the excluded histories that inform our present in order to make other futures and make our futures other. And I believe teachers can participate in a politics of collaboration because pedagogies of freedom are pedagogies of co-learning, and by learning together, we can build empathy and solidarity. Finally, I believe collective action needs to foreground the asymmetry of privilege by giving platforms to those who have been traditionally silenced. And this is the way I believe we can make futures together. That's what I have today. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, can I do something? Yes. I didn't plan this. Okay. Eve Chuck, who's the author, co-author of Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, tweeted this great tweet like a month ago. So I should have read it before. Because I hate that when Q&As, you first get the person that is not a question, but they just have opinions. And then you get the other person that it's like, why am I not? I should be giving a lecture. Why are you not talking about what I care about? So Eve tweeted like this great resource for Q&As. And let me see if I remember. I think we take a minute and you talk with the person next to you, like in little groups. Also, you can relax for a second. It's like, and like test drive your question. Like think of questions. Yeah, not to me, but to someone that's next to you. And just test drive that question. Does that make sense? Is it really a question? And think about questions together. And then in like 2 minutes, we regroup, and then we do the Q&A.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Yeah? Yeah? A little more time, or? This is my teaching ring. It's like a bent spoon, but I just use it to create noise. And then my students look up and it's like, yeah, now, yeah, like, good questions now.
Good, that helps.
Yeah, did that help?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm curious sort of how your collective responded to them not wanting to touch the historic architecture of the Chicago Plaza.
Well, it was a difficult process because we couldn't directly talk to the folks in charge of the building. We had to go through the curators. So it was a difficult negotiation. And now we want to talk to them now that everything's set up, because we understand that basically once they sort of saw everything come together, they really liked it, and we're told they sort of perhaps wish they had thought of it. So now we want to talk to them and see if there's anything we can do together. I mean, some things were very pragmatic, and that when you're in the middle of this conversation, it can be very frustrating when someone says, oh, we need to be able to take out the sign because sometimes there are weddings there and the bride is not going to want to see settler colonialism in the middle of her wedding. And I'm like, that would be informative. So some conversations were frustrating. Some conversations were more about, well, perhaps how will a public react to this language? And I think sometimes folks don't give publics enough credit for what they can see and process. But it was overall very constructive, and it turned out okay. But it's difficult because it had to be mediated, so it was a long process, but that's how things get done. It's a little weird as someone who is like a former architect in a way, but now sort of to present in this architecture exhibition, I'm used to being a historian, and I like being a historian because then I can write whatever I want. And going back to this, I want to say it's a sort of practice, it's a practicing history, right? Means also going back to, oh, wait, now I have to convince someone, which is frustrating. But it's okay. Yeah, other questions? Conversations and thoughts?
Earlier today in your workshop, you had said that it's easy to lose track of the political dimension of your work when you're caught up in the formal excitement of your studio project. And I wondered if you had advice for scaffolding studio culture or studio projects that kept a closer eye on political implications.
Well, just an awareness that the spaces you're designing convey and have embedded within them politics, whether you want to or not, right? That a tight corridor is going to be uncomfortable, that certain spaces may segregate people that are not able-bodied, that a bathroom is an intensely political space, depending on how it's labeled and the shapes that it takes. So it's not, you can, I like to think that neutrality is not, if you're neutral, then you're not, at any position you take is political. And neutrality means giving it to the opposite side, right? So just don't be carried away by neutrality. Just have an awareness of what you are designing entails. Yes?
Thank you for the talk. It was fascinating. The descriptive language is quite performative in academia. You operate from the sustained regime of academia. But you hinted at the map, the way you think native indigenous people map their land. You hinted at the ways in which they render something legible, their aesthetic regimes. I was wondering if you have more on that subject. Have you looked at oral histories, or have you looked at different ways of communicating knowledge? And are there any more of those maps? Not Wisconsin.
There are several projects. The map that I showed is a hydroshed map, so it's a product of Western cartography. There are several indigenous projects that we looked at, but we are not the indigenous city project. We're the settler colonial city project, so we speak as settlers, and we want to position and be aware of our privilege and our position within that system. It is our awareness of that position that compels us to act. That's why we acted with the American Indian Center in Chicago. We researched and are aware. There are several indigenous mapping projects that operate in different ways to map the land, to recover the histories of the land, and to build new histories. I don't have those examples with me right now, but there are several ways in which different indigenous architects, cartographers, and activists are using these tools also to operate. A bigger description of indigenous ontology of the land, I think, should come also from an indigenous scholar. But what I would say is that it's, again, decolonization compels us to attempt to understand that ontology and also understand our awareness that this is not part of my personal experience. Right? Yes?
In some classes, we've been talking about sort of this Western canon that we all sort of have growing up in the West, but now with the decolonization, there's sort of this, not necessarily a new canon forming. I guess, where do you see the intersection between sort of what we have been grown up to be like taught versus this sort of hidden I guess, what do we do with this information that we just sort of learn? Where do you see it like carrying on, or where does it intersect with what we already know? Like, how does it change, I guess?
I don't know. I think I'm part of all these collectives that are struggling to figure this out, sort of a global history of architecture, feminist history of architecture, feminist intersectional history of architecture. And I think it's important not to be overwhelmed by the sort of opposition to the word Western, because perhaps that's not such a productive approach to say Western and non-Western, because binaries are always tricky, right? And it's better to think, oh, I have been distortedly looking at only this production where there was a bigger universe. How to organize production that has taken place throughout and understand it. And that's an ongoing struggle, because you can never produce a history of everything, right? So I think teaching history and learning the history of architecture is about thinking through the criteria what our responsibility for the built environment is and how that has played out throughout time. I'm going to say, how about like other genders asking questions, not to like stifle, but since this is YSO? Yes. I'm going to yes, there you go.
So I really like the objectives of this project. I was kind of wondering, do you see like implementations of this project's objectives on like a larger or even a more intimate local scale? And if so, kind of how do you see this moving along?
You mean the Central Colonial City project?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. We are, if you look at the website, we see ourselves as, we have this one site in the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and we have other sites and other plans and are eager to collaborate and to work in other places. And some of our actions are at the biennial, and we may have other actions that are not part of the biennial coming up. So I want to mention one that is within the biennial, but is one that I think, to me, it was a prerequisite, which is one of the events we call the Petro Biennial Complex. And it's a conversation of the BP funding the biennial. Because oil extraction has happened in indigenous lands and caused great struggle from the Amazon jungle to North Dakota, right? So having an action that's premised on the importance and the recuperation of indigeneity in a biennial that's funded by BP, it's very problematic, particularly in the context of just general funding of cultural washing that's going on, a conversation that's going on right now. I'm a graduate from MIT, and we just had this conversation on Epstein's funding of the Media Lab there. So that is something that I am looking forward to, and that was very important to have as part of the project. I just wanted to mention that. Yeah. What? Yeah, Daniela.
So I have many questions, but just my one.
Okay.
I was thinking about something you said. I can't remember what you just said now, but it has to do with I think you phrased it so like us historians, architectural historians, is dealing with the built environment. And one of the things that has changed for me since I, sort of trained and started being an architectural historian, many years have passed, and then incorporating these ideas and discussions about decolonization is that, is the division between the natural and the built environment is very, it's a product of that colonial construction, and so questioning it and not taking it for granted. And so I've started to look for sources that could, bridge that division or question it. But I was wondering how you see that as a sort of new, could it be a new way of doing architectural history that undoes the distinction between the natural and the built? Or are we just trying to we are trying to take over everything as architectural historians, we can now talk about everything, and especially in the context of, climate change and all the stuff that's going on.
No, I find this incredibly productive. Like when thinking about the U.S. plains and the substitution of the Chicago ramp for wheat, right? We look at a landscape, like a field of wheat, and we perhaps think of it as a natural landscape when it's an artificial landscape, right? So that's also part of the history of our environment and a history of settler colonialism. We, in Argentina, look at, and here also we look at cows as a staple, right, when they're European visitors, let's say, right, import. So, yeah, I think these are larger histories of the environment, perhaps. But as historians, you and I know and have had these conversations, in a way, we can never, that's why we are teachers, right? Because we can never finish learning. So these are tough choices that we all have to make. It's like, what do you teach? How much? Because you can never teach everything. Or then you're like my dissertation chair, Mark Jarsenbeck. He wrote the history of everything. He has this book on the global history of architecture. So I think that this is, in a way, the critical position of the teacher, of how much to teach and how to frame these histories so that our students can be their own teachers, right? And just have the criteria to follow up with their own interests along these critical lines. Yes?
So just a fast question. I'm struck by how obvious for most of us it would be to determine our position related to being involved in settler colonialism and what legacy we hold related to this topic. So you offered up decolonization is not a metaphor as some first reading to take on. And I wonder if you want to offer, or if you'd be willing to offer another title or two.
Oh, sure. Oh, I will give you a syllabus. I was part of this reading group. Just Google Standing Rock syllabus. And there's a whole syllabus. All the PDFs are online. It's long. We had a reading group throughout an academic year, and we didn't get through everything. But you can just start with the introduction readings. And there's a beautiful timeline also. It's very pedagogically made. It's made by indigenous scholars. This is a great resource. What? Oh, we're wrapping it up. Yes, okay, sorry. Not very subtle, sorry. Thank you so much. Oh, no, yes.